I'm here to introduce Dr. Sheila McGinn, who is a professor of New Testament and early Christianity, as well as the chair of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at John Carroll University. She is a frequent lecturer and the author of numerous articles and books, and her main area of interest concerns the development of the earliest churches, including dissenting movements, as well as the study of early Christian writings in their social and cultural contexts. She has published on topics ranging from the letters of Paul to contemporary engaged methods of adult pedagogy. Her most recent books are The Jesus Movement and the World of the Early Church, in a co-edited volume, By Bread Alone, The Bible Through the Eyes of the Hungry. Last year, she taught a course in John Carroll's MA program titled Teaching Theology and Religious Studies to, with, and for adolescents and young adults. Today, she will be speaking to us on Jesus and justice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sheila McGinn.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you all. I feel like a Verizon commercial, but can you hear me now? It's okay. Okay. So a little bit of alliteration here, Jesus and justice, the Jubilee Proclamation of the reign of God. In the interest of making sure you all know the telos of this talk, we're practicing our Greek today, by the way. That won't be the last Greek word that comes up here. My basic agenda, which probably will not take 40 minutes, I'm hoping actually that it won't, is to lay out some key critical ideas about Jesus' proclamation that whether you're teaching New Testament or whether you're teaching Christology, or for that matter, whether you're teaching Christian, Catholic social teaching, that these kinds of issues will be feasible to bring into any of those classes. So I'd like to save enough time toward the end. I think I've practiced this so that we have time at the end, that we can have a good conversation about here's how you might use this piece or how you might use this other piece to that end. As a little sort of caveat at the beginning, what I'm talking about here with Jesus, claiming that Jesus has a Jubilee proclamation, is a little bit counterintuitive. If you were to look up a word search of New Testament terms, this will not appear. The word Jubilee, or its Hebrew root, Yobel, will not appear. So what I'm going to lay out for you is, here's the content. When you look at the Hebrew Bible, here's the content of the Jubilee Proclamation. Here are the basic features of that proclamation. How does Jesus line up with it? And I've focused today on the Gospel according to Luke, partly because Luke is very interested in this dynamic, and partly because it keeps us from getting confused about who's Jesus and that sort of thing. We don't have to differentiate between a particular evangelist's theology of Jesus Christ in order to do that. So I've got 4 case studies that we're going to go through in terms of the Gospel according to Luke, all of which I think will be at least somewhat familiar to you, even if you don't actually teach New Testament per se. And so to start off, here's what, I should back up. So the reign of God. In most translations, that expression, basileia to theou, basileia is another one of the Greek words, okay? It'll be on a slide, you can write it down. It will be on the test, right? The reign of God, I'm using the term reign of God because, well, first of all, because Americans don't get the concept of kingdom. I mean, that was one of our principles at the beginning, right? Is we're not going to have a king. We have people who lord it over others, however, on various levels and by various means, primarily socioeconomic, right? So we don't have a monarchy like that. But to remember that when Jesus is proclaiming the dominion of God, the reign of God, it is a political dynamic. It is a political concept, right? And so whenever Jesus talks about the reign of God, it's always over against the dominion, the other dominions that already exist in his world, and primarily that means over against the Empire of Rome, right? So it's not an exclusively religious concept. In fact, none of Jesus' teaching actually is exclusively religious. All of these concepts originate in the political and legal realm, right? So this is one piece that I know students have a really hard time getting, right? Because in America, we think, well, as the expression goes, separation of church and state, right? So we think that politics should be over here and religion should be over there. We're still the only country in the world where that's the case, right? And historically, it was absolutely never the case, right? So the weird sort of liminal state for Catholics in America is to deal with how is it that our claim as Catholic has to do with this political concept, and yet we're not electing Jesus to be president, right? We can't rule the political realm. So how does that interplay of theology and politics, how do we negotiate those boundaries there without violating other people's rights, but also without kind of letting go of who we are as Catholics? Okay, so Jesus' Jubilee Proclamation. Original Jubilee Proclamation we find in Leviticus 25. You shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives 49 years. That's in case you were math-averse. Then you shall have the trumpet sounded loud. On the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement, which, as you know, we just celebrated last week, you shall have the trumpet sounded throughout all your land, and you shall hallow the 50th year. And you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return, every one of you, to your property, and every one of you to your family. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow or reap the aftergrowth or harvest the unpruned vines, for it shall be a jubilee, it shall be holy to you. Thus does the book of Leviticus introduce the festival of Jubilee with 4 broad strokes outlining the socioeconomic corrections that are to be instituted at the outset of each Jubilee year. Now here again, when you're talking to your students in class, you've got students coming from families who think that an unbridled free market economy is divinely ordained and is the only way to run an economy, right? And so you have to deal with that as part of your context, your audience's context, right? Leviticus has no idea about that ideology. The biblical tradition does not give warrant to an unbridled free market economy. It always keeps in the picture who's getting hurt by this economy, who's getting marginalized by the economy, because it's not about a particular type of economy. Any economy is going to have its problems. Any economic system is going to have its problems, right? So how do you make sure that those problems don't become so ingrained that they are irreversible? Well, Jubilee is the solution that you get in the book of Leviticus. Okay? So these are both socioeconomic and ecological correctives. First of all, liberty to all the land's inhabitants. John Carroll right now has ongoing this little study about slavery and the history of the Jesuit tradition, and because Bishop John Carroll himself, held slaves. I mean, the Jesuit order held slaves, etc. Slaves built the University of Georgetown, for example. I'm pretty sure that wasn't the case in 1938. In University Heights, that these buildings were built by union workers, actually, but nevertheless, there's an implication, right? There's a responsibility about this slaveholding tradition. So we have a hard time understanding, again, because slavery has been outlawed for over 100 years. we have a hard time understanding what this deal is about liberty to captives. You could have political prisoners who are imprisoned because they ended up on the wrong side of a political dispute. You could have slaves who are held captive because they ended up on the losing side in a war. You could have people in slavery just like today because they're being used in the sex trade. You could have people like, I still remember the days when I always had like too few nickels to get through the end of the month, It wasn't that long ago, student loans and all that sort of stuff, right? You graduate college and you feel like you have a mortgage even though you don't have a house to go with it, that kind of thing, In the ancient world, the way you worked that is you didn't go into debt and just like have some bank, help cover you and rely on you to get a paying job so that you could pay them back and stuff like that. You just sold yourself into slavery, And it might be an indentured servitude for X many years, but that's how you dealt with debt. So most people in the ancient world who were slaves either were captives in war, were born into slavery, or were debt slaves. They got so far into debt that the only way to deal with it was to sell their bodies and those of their relatives to whoever held that banknote, whoever held that loan. Okay? So proclamation of liberty to all the land's inhabitants, not just the Israelites, but even the aliens who lived in the land of Israel. Return of ancestral lands to the allotted clan. Can you imagine that? Have you ever, not too many years ago, I had 2 students in my class who were at that moment homeless because the economic situation, the family was tough. Mom had lost her job, and then about 6 months later, Dad was out of work too. They were living with Grandma and Grandpa at the time, or the young man was living with his grandparents at the time, and they'd had to split the family, and so the girls were with somebody else, and he was with his paternal grandparents and that sort of thing. They'd lost the land not because of anything his parents ever did except work for the wrong company that went out of business or that needed to downsize, as they call it, right? Other people lose their property. 5 million people in the United States in recent years have gone bankrupt because of health costs, uninsured health expenses, right? 5 million people. That's percentage-wise probably not huge. It's still remarkable as a statistic, right? So what happens to those families who lose their home? There are a lot of things we're willing to let go as parents. Some of you are parents at least, right? A lot of things we're willing to let go. But can you imagine the only house your kids ever knew? Having to give that up because you just couldn't make the payments anymore? How difficult that would be. And we also know statistically what happens to kids who don't have a stable home base, right? The one predictor of success, of completing a high school, getting a high school diploma, completing a high school course of studies, is that your parents actually live in a house that they own. That they live. They may. Well, my bank owns my house, but anyway, you know what I mean, right? They live in the home where their parents have the mortgage, right? It's not an apartment. They don't live with other relatives. So it's the stability of the location that grounds kids when they're, there they are, 13 to 17 years old, and really, honestly, you know this better than I do, and this is why I don't teach high school. They're really more hormones than brains, right? They are dealing with so many things, including the physiological changes that take place there. Can you imagine how unsettling that is? I can sort of remember, and I try not to, because people say, oh, that was the time of your life. Yeah, that was the worst time of my life. Don't make me go back there, right? It's already hard because of all those kinds of social and physiological dynamics. And then you take the bottom out by saying, yeah, we're moving tomorrow because we lost the house, right? So return of ancestral lands to the clan means that even if those kinds of terrible things happen to your family, they aren't forever. America used to be the land of opportunity precisely because of that those kinds of damaging changes to a family weren't forever. You know, after a couple hundred years now, we've got a momentum going, and the question is, are we going to make sure that stays the case, that damage isn't forever? Or are we going to just kind of roll with the system and let it get ingrained to a point where it is, right? Return of family members to that ancestral land. So that means not just you're going home for a family reunion, which is always interesting, and sometimes fun, you know, depends, right? All the characters come out then, right? You know what I mean. Return of the family members means that even if they lived in a foreign land, they're liberated too, right? Even if they ended up enslaved to a foreign power, you bring them home, right? You buy them back. You liberate them. They are, quote, saved, right? This is one of the, quote, religious words we use. It really has to do with a very concrete social dynamic, right? People are saved. It means they aren't owned by another human being, right? They're owned by God alone. So they go back to that ancestral land. And the other piece, which isn't explored very well in the New Testament, but is important for us today, is this part about the land itself gets a break. You know, there's recognition that the land has rights. The land is let fallow for the year. Now that happened every 7 years, but it happens 2 years in a row, between the sabbatical year 49, right, and then in the Jubilee year. What happens when you don't let the land lie fallow? I was born in Iowa, so I know all this farm stuff. Any of you folks know that sort of thing? What happens when you don't let the land lie fallow?
It becomes a metropolis.
Pardon?
It becomes a big city.
But farm-wise.
You can overuse the land. All the nutrients are gone.
All the nutrients get sucked out, that's right. Anybody else? So if you want to make it grow things, what do you have to do then if you suck all the nutrients out because you haven't given it a break? Pardon? Fertilizer. Yeah, you got to put chemicals into it, right? Okay, which are really great for our groundwater and all that sort of thing, right? Now when you let the land lie fallow, that means you're not planting, you're not plowing, right? All that sort of thing. You're not making seed grow there. But stuff grows anyway, right? Just like this. I mean, prairie grass in our part of the world, you know, prairie grass comes up, all the stuff I keep trying to rip out of my garden, but it really sort of belongs there, right? Thistles and things that are really not very fun to walk through, but, you know, it sort of belongs there, right? And it's not unused. It's just not used by humans, right? So what you would do is you would put your crops on, you would put your flocks on that land, right? So you got a bunch of sheep or goats or whatever you got. Well, what do they do when they're grazing on this land that you haven't plowed to make, say, to raise grain or right, exactly, right? So the manure from to use, you know, to be not totally blunt, but yeah, you know, it replenishes the soil, right? That's a natural fertilizer, right? So there's this cycle created where where the animals grazing on that land restore the land, probably not to exactly where it was 7 years before, but it helps to prevent permanent damage to the land. The other thing you do, of course, is rotate crops and stuff like that. That's not part of the Jubilee tradition. That's just being smart. You know. Okay. So, like I said, this last one about the liberty of the land is not in terms of the ecological aspect of that. The liberty of the land shows up in the New Testament, but the whole question of ecology isn't explored in detail in the New Testament, hardly explored at all, and actually the best place for that is the book of Revelation, sort of remarkably. But it certainly would be an avenue that could work in a contemporary high school class. Okay. What's the significance of the liberation of the land and the people? Land isn't sold in perpetuity because it belongs to God. We don't own the earth. We belong to it. God owns the earth. We belong to God. We're, quote, aliens and tenants, according to Leviticus. According to Genesis 1 and 2, we're the stewards of the garden, right? Dependent kin must be supported and their land redeemed back whenever possible. Now, I think most families do support each other like this anyway, but it's interesting that it's not a foregone conclusion anymore in this country anyway, right? Fellow Israelites may not be kept as slaves. They have to be treated as hired servants, hired laborers, day laborers, or if you want to keep them for a longer period of time because they owe you money, then indentured laborers who are going to have like a 5-year contract or a 7-year contract or something like that. You all remember the story of Jacob and his uncle, and how Jacob works for his uncle Laban to because he didn't have money for a bride price, right, to get his wife, and Laban jerks him around. So he ends up with 2 wives instead of the one he wanted over a period of 14 years, right? So it's not like indentured servitude can't be abused, right? You have that one sort of example there. But certainly indentured servants can be abused. The point is, there's still an end, right? You can't sell yourself for life. If your kin fall into poverty and they're enslaved to resident aliens, the family member has the right to redeem them, regardless of what the alien wants or not. You know, you just pay whatever it is, and now the person's liberated. Okay. So this whole thing about this focus on freedom of the individual, you know, that should resonate pretty well with high school kids, whose kind of refrain is, don't tell me what to do. You're not the boss of me. What's the freedom for? You're nodding your head like that's a really good question. So do you have an answer maybe?
I think it's just a great point. I remember in theology class at Boston College, just talked about it's always freedom for, not just freedom from something, but freedom for. And I think oftentimes we can talk about it in terms of freedom for God, to worship God in spirit and truth.
Okay, great. Any other ideas? And that ties in very well, by the way, with the Romans passage we just looked at an hour ago. Any other ideas? So freedom for God, what does that mean? Yeah?
Well, it's like being enslaved to the Jews without such a free. So it's freedom for enslavement to freedom.
This is a man after my own heart. He's very Augustinian, even though he doesn't know it, right? Right? Whom to serve is perfect freedom, right? That to serve God is perfect freedom. Why would that be the case, though? I mean, it doesn't. It's like this poor young man who's a major in our department came in about a week and a half ago saying, really sucks to be a theology major. It's like, okay, we should talk about this. What's going on? And he's loving it, right? He's loving it, but he's just getting so much crap from his peers about, yeah, and what do you do with that? Do you want fries? I mean, they're giving him grief about like whether he'd be employable. Okay, I got to tell you, we got people in all sorts of companies that will probably not hire you because you're giving him trouble. But anyway, yes?
In like full and total like union and relationship with God, you're free. Like the idea is that you're free from like the demands of like society kind of thing. Like
That certainly could work, and I think high school kids, you tell me, but I think high school kids would get that. Yeah, Adam?
I was just going to say, God's smarter than we are. So if he's the one calling the shots, that's better than you calling the shots.
Okay. That's probably not going to play very well with high school kids, depending.
Freedom for what's all that is good, beautiful, and true.
Yeah, there you go, right? So when you think, like, this gives you an avenue into, like, so when you talk about God, when you use that word God, what does that mean, right? You know, our little slogan on the T-shirts for our department is the beginning of Philippians 4:8. You know, whatsoever things are true, and Paul goes on this list: true, beautiful, just, honorable, worthy of respect, etc. Right? Like, if that's who God is, all those things, then yeah, isn't it actually pretty cool to be able to serve? Because what's the alternative? You got a bunch of other lords you could serve, a bunch of other masters you could serve, and they don't look like that, right? You know, so then it looks really appealing if you think about, you're going to have a master. You're not the master, but you're going to have one, so which master will you serve? Well, I'll take God any day, thank you very much. Yes, Tony?
Freedom for working for the freedom of others.
Okay, that's also good, right? So this part about, yeah, if your family members fall into enslavement, yeah, part of the task is to make sure they have that kind of freedom too. Yes, sir.
Well, and how about a very practical one, to say, keep warm and well fed. You talk to kids, and some of them, situations at home, don't give me Jesus crap or God crap, because there's no food in our cupboard. So don't tell me praise God, love God, God loves you, and my daily life is survivalism. So the freedom, the internal freedom is intrinsically connected. And when you start out with the economic or social context that we're in, it's not, oh, here's my life and here's my spiritual life over here.
Right.
There's an integration of those two. So some of the very practical applications of freedom,
Right.
here, not to be bound, not to be oppressed.
Right.
Those are triggers to help people and kids realize, the internal freedom, the internal, I have time, I can make room even to think spiritually or of God, because I'm not worried about just the practical things.
Right, but also when I think about God, or spiritually, if you will, always in that horizon is God, who's one of those folks who are enslaved or are in poverty, right? That this is where I'm finding God, right? That I become unified with God when I work toward this kind of liberation.
But that's where we get stuck. I can identify with the suffering Christ.
Uh-huh.
But the call of Christ is not just to be there. It doesn't end on Friday. The goal is liberation. And that liberation isn't just, I can identify with the enslaved, with the marginalized. But I think the call of the gospel is freedom out of that as well. It ends on Sunday of sorts.
So I'm not sure I'm hearing you. So you're saying freedom even when you're in that circumstance?
Yes, I mean there's the hope of freedom even when we suffer.
Sure, of course, right. But I don't have a hope of freedom when I'm standing around sitting on my hands watching somebody else suffer. That's not Christian freedom, right? When I'm standing around sitting on my hands watching somebody else suffer, that's a violation of this Jubilee idea, right? That my hope of freedom is when I am standing around in solidarity with the people who suffer and trying to make that suffering less. So I'm not denying a transcendent reality here. I'm saying
I don't think it's
I'm saying that these are two, we tend to separate transcendent and immanent, right? These are two, this is really a dyadic reality. They're implicated in each other. And our tradition, as you know, has been very good about, praying for the poor, like you quoted from James, the Epistle of James, praying for the poor and then, going on and doing things as usual, okay? The Jubilee tradition does not, it sets itself up at the very beginning. This is not business as usual. We only do this every 50 years, right? But when we do this every 50 years, it has to be a dramatic shift from what we normally do every other year. Somebody else had a hand up. Yes, ma'am.
Mine is similar to theirs, freedom to live a full and dignified life so that you can take care of yourself and your family. But I'd like to just make a comment that when my kids return the land to the original clan, their first thought is, that's not fair. What about the people that are on that land? They don't like that at all.
Sure, and that's good that they don't like it.
They hate it.
That's okay, because the Bible isn't something you're supposed to love.
And it's not always fair. Like, the kingdom of God, like, God doesn't promise us fairness.
Well, it's fair depending on your angle, right? I'm looking at the ancestral home, that my grandparents lost. It wasn't fair they lost it. I don't really think I want to go back and live in Benton, Wisconsin, which has a population of maybe about 3,500 people. I'm too citified, for that to really work for me. But, it does raise the question, though. You're right. It raises a really interesting question. And this is, I don't know about you, but this is what I love in the classroom, is when we got a really difficult question. And now we've got to look at it from lots of different sides, right? I'm not talking about land reform here necessarily today. It would be a dramatic thing to go back to a slate, a blank slate and say 40 acres and a mule, okay? And to decide how to reallocate resources, land resources in this country. That would be a fascinating kind of, exercise to do. But in Leviticus, it's not about, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah as a whole, and certainly in Leviticus, it's not about individuals, right? This is about the clan, right? And when the land of Israel is divided up among the 12 tribes, this tribe gets this territory, this tribe gets that territory. So it's about communal integrity. It really functions more like national borders than like individual family, right? So we have to think when we're not talking individual family, we're talking uber family here. And today actually, pretty much, there are some new nations that are trying to arise among the Kurds and the Catalonians and a few other peoples like that. But basically, national borders have been pretty stable in the last, say, not quite 75 years or so, right? So this notion that a people shouldn't be able to come in and steal land from another nation, I think they actually can get their head around that, but it does raise some really cool questions and, makes them think that maybe the Bible is weirder than they thought. It's really important to make sure they see the weird. I don't know how else to put that, They have to be off balance because they are, this. They think they're 13, 14 years old. They already know everything, right? Don't they? I don't know. When I went away to college, I know at 17, I already knew everything. My parents were the dumbest. They were slightly smarter than most rocks, But I really thought they were pretty dumb. And then I came home at Christmas time and I thought, God, what, you guys been studying or something? You got smart while I was gone. We have to somehow break that kind of prejudice or whatever among young people. And maybe today they do think their parents are smarter. I don't know. Maybe I just had serious hubris. Okay, Jubilee and liberation from poverty. Every Sabbath year, according to Deuteronomy 15, debts are remitted. This is why it's dumb for Jeremiah to buy the potter's field, in like the 9th month of the 6th year, okay? Because he's going to lose it all in 3 months, right? Jubilee follows those sabbatical laws It's like the Uber Sabbath, right? It's the Mama Sabbath. And so debt forgiveness is intrinsic to the Jubilee tradition. This piece, unlike the land piece that's not really taken up, or at least the ecological part of the land, isn't really taken up in the New Testament tradition, the debt remission is absolutely fundamental to the message of Jesus. Christian tradition has tended to spiritualize the notions of forgiveness and redemption and taken them out of their original economic and legal contexts. And so we really need to work hard to get those contexts back and to help kids recover this really concrete meaning of these terms. I get, you probably do too, I get sort of pat lines. What did Jesus come for? To save us from our sins. Okay. What's the importance of Jesus? Well, forgiveness. What is that? Well, it's about sins, right? I get those. When you try to explore that with a student, they don't necessarily have the language to go past that, right? How could Jesus save me from sins I hadn't committed yet? I'm not saying he couldn't, right? I'm just asking that question, and then they're kind of stuck. They're stymied, right? If you can recover this concrete social, economic, political dynamic to the question of forgiveness and redemption. So the redemption has to do with buying somebody out of slavery. Few of us who are lucky enough to have families that have some discretionary resources, right? Maybe you graduated college with a couple, with some student loans, but your parents helped you pay them off, right? Do you remember the last time you paid off a note? About 3 years ago, I paid off the car. It's like I really wanted to burn that, just as a celebration, right? People who pay off their mortgage, they often have a barbecue, right, and use the mortgage to start the charcoal and stuff like that. Why is it? Why are people so excited about that kind of thing? It's about freedom, right? How so? Because the bank wasn't going to come and sell you to somebody who lives in Kurdistan or whatever. I mean, they didn't have the authority to do that, right? They weren't going to make you move to Texas or someplace else, right? But what is it about that now you don't owe that anymore? Yeah, Adam.
I was going to say, it opens up your abilities and priorities. You can focus your time and efforts on different things that were consumed with the object of your debt.
With trying to make sure that you always had enough nickels to pay that, whatever it was, right? And if you had an adjustable rate loan or something, that just adds to the level of stress about how much am I really going to owe, and that kind of thing, right? So there's a lot of psychological relief, right? When you don't owe, especially if it was a big loan, when you don't owe that, right? And the notion of owning your home, I'm going to keep my mortgage because I like the tax deduction, but on the other hand, I really get it why people want to own their own home, especially folks as they get older, because how frightening to think that there'd be a possibility of being homeless if you lost your job, or if you lost your health care and insurance and had to pay out of pocket. I mean, So there are a lot of reasons why why liberation from debt, why that can resonate with people. Does that work with high school kids though? Do they get that sort of stuff? I mean, we can talk about that later, about what actually kind of works for them to get that across. As I mentioned earlier, because of the length of time that we've got here, and I want to leave a lot of room for conversation, I'm trying to restrict this Jubilee in Jesus material only to the Gospel according to Luke. So now I'm going to turn to 4 Lucan texts to see how this Jubilee tradition is embedded in the teaching of Jesus, even though, as I mentioned, he never actually says the word Jubilee. The phrase he uses, the year of the Lord's favor, okay, which is sort of an equivalent term. Okay, here's just an idea to get you started. I know a couple of you have endured this because you had me for New Testament. But how to get high school kids thinking about this, because we know they come from all sorts of, their families are all across the political spectrum, right? And they really, their view of poverty is, well, people should just stop being lazy, or at least some of them, their view of poverty, people should just stop being lazy and get a job. It's like, yeah, do you realize that I don't know what it is right now, but unemployment rate in Cleveland has been as high as 15% in the last few years. Do you realize that? And do you also realize that most of the people who are in poverty actually are working? They're just working minimum wage jobs, and there's not a county in the United States where a minimum wage job at 40 hours a week will get you an apartment. Not a single one, right? No, they don't get that. But anyway, what they do know is that they've been taught a whole bunch about sexuality, and therefore Jesus must be all about sex, and right? You know this, right? Jesus must have had a really, really hard line on sexual morality, and they don't know squat about whether Jesus taught about economics. That's not an insult to them. That's just in terms of proportion of what they've heard, in preaching or in school, okay? So if you were going to identify a few passages where Jesus teaches about sexuality, any ideas? We've got to have a couple people who know the Bible here. Maybe? Yes?
So in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, there's a teaching against divorce.
In the Sermon on the Mount? Yeah, there is a thing about, when can a man divorce his wife? Right. Yeah. Okay. And the answer? Never. And then the disciples complain and they say, well, that sucks. Why get married? And Jesus said, it's okay. You can be a eunuch. Fascinating as the alternative. But any place else you can think of in Matthew? Matthew has the divorce thing twice. And first is in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5. Then it recurs again in chapter 19. And that's where you get the exception about, well, in the case of porneia, it's all right. Porneia there usually construed as adultery. Yes?
In Matthew, Jesus also discusses in the Sermon on the Mount about how even looking at a woman, lustfully is committing adultery. Okay. Where the part where the antitheses where he's saying, you heard it said this, and I'm telling you something else that's harder. Good? Okay. So Matthew 5:32, that's the first divorce piece. I didn't get the lustful thing looking here. This Matthew 19, that's the second piece about divorce. 11 and 12 is the line about becoming a eunuch for the kingdom of God. That's it, by the way, in Matthew. Now, how about, where do we find Jesus talking about money? Economics, poverty, slavery, whatever, those sorts of things. Gave you one place here.
Isn't there the Mammon passage?
The which?
Mammon.
Oh, right, about what's the greatest commandment, right? To serve God with all your heart, etc., including all your wealth, okay? And about not being able to serve God and mammon, right? Okay. I don't think I have that one in the list here, but anybody? Yes?
The parables of the worker and the field.
Good, right? The one we heard a couple weeks ago about, the people complaining because they didn't get way more than the day's wage when the people who came in the last hour got the day's wage. That's another good one that high school kids love to hate. There was, you're supposed to hate that parable, right? You're supposed to hate that. And then you're supposed to get into it. And it's like, so who would be left after all that time? Who would be left? Who wouldn't have been hired? Yeah?
Those that were least able.
Right. The folks who had some physical disability And people look at him and think, well, you can't, I need somebody who can actually do this job, right? Yeah, so folks who are too young, too old, otherwise, quote, disabled in some way or another, yeah, they're the ones who wouldn't get hired, okay, and they shouldn't eat, because 1 day's wage is what it takes for them to not die that night, right? So the Lord, the master, gives them 1 day's wage, so they will live till the next day. Now that's not that's not very secure living, right? It is just subsistence. But should they have gotten less than the first ones, right? No, the first ones actually just want way more, right? Because they're already advantaged and they want to keep that advantage. I mean, anyway, great. Anything else?
The parable of the rich man and the eye of the camel, is that related?
Both, yes. Parable of the rich young ruler in Matthew, and Luke is just a rich young man, right? And you get the stuff about the eye of the needle. This is the vineyard, one-liners. And then you got another whole set. And nobody mentioned yet, because I'm not letting you, because I'm paying attention to time here. Nobody mentioned yet the Last Judgment scene, which is pretty harsh. Like, you didn't feed these people, you didn't give them water. See you around. Outer darkness with the wailing and gnashing of teeth, right? I mean, that's pretty harsh. This one, nobody mentioned.
Where's the last rich man Lazarus? Which one is that?
That's in Luke. But anyway, this one here. Whoops, sorry. Go back. Matthew 6, this is the Lord's Prayer, right? What do we pray for? Daily bread, you know. But also forgiveness of debts, as we forgive our debtors, to use the Protestant translation. But it's close enough, right? Okay, anyway. So there are lots. There are probably close to 40. If you get, if you divide up into 4 groups in class and you assign each group one of the Gospels, there are got to be at least 40 independent examples of Jesus talking about poverty, wealth, slavery, lending, etc., like that. There are 4, count them, 4 places where Jesus has anything to do with sexuality, and it's basically about marriage and divorce. Except for, like I said, the eunuch thing, which I'm pretty sure none of your high school kids are going to be too excited about, picking up. Okay, so where do you hear Jubilee in the New Testament? Okay, just moving right along here. The inaugural address of Jesus at the synagogue in Nazareth is really the closest thing as we get to a Jubilee proclamation for Jesus. And that this is a quotation from Isaiah 61, so from 3rd Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because God has anointed me to bring good news, evangelion, to the poor. The word there is tokoi. It means destitute, landless, homeless would be a good translation. God has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. The oppressed are political prisoners as opposed to slaves of other varieties, right? And to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So that the year of the Lord's favor, that's the closest thing we get to Jubilee, right? So here's a comparison what Leviticus 25 says about Jubilee and what Jesus in Luke 4 says about Jubilee, right? We get liberty to the oppressed, which is equated basically to evangelion, good news to the poor. Now, evangelion is not generic good news. These are your 2 Greek words, or your 2 other Greek words for the day. It's not generic good news. Evangelion is first used in 2nd Isaiah, Isaiah 52, verse 7, where beautiful on the mountains are the feet of the messenger who brings evangelion, who proclaims peace, who proclaims words of happiness. Our God reigns, right? So evangelion in the Hebrew Bible, which is the only Bible Jesus had, means God has brought an end to war and God is the ruling authority. In the Roman Empire, that's challenging, to say the least, right? So the good news is we don't belong to anybody else other than God. And also, the implied here is liberation of the land, because if you win a war, that means you get your land back, right? That's part of the deal with war. So you get liberty to captives. You get physical wholeness, which is interesting, not mentioned in the Jubilee tradition, but certainly central to Jesus' ministry, where you have healing miracles being a really big part of what he does to show that this is the year of the Lord's favor. Okay, then we skipping right along here to Mary's Magnificat, going backwards in time in terms of the gospel, of course, but forward in time in terms of the biblical tradition. Mary talks about this divine reversal, right? I'm lowly, God's raised me up, generations will call me blessed. The mighty one is, with the holy name, has done these things. That divine mercy is on those who fear God. That God has shown power, strength of arm, has scattered the proud, has brought down the mighty from their thrones. Whoa, that's scary, right? But that's all about political upheaval. Right? And God has lifted up the lowly, the ones who were marginated. Now those are the folks who are back in. And then there's a hint to this promise. With the promise to Abraham, there's this hint of restoration of the land, right? Because the promise to Abraham was of land and descendants, right? So again, how does this match up with Leviticus 25? Pretty well, actually. Pretty well. The land... There's, again, nothing ecological about the land. It's about who owns the land. I think there's sort of this presumption that if Israel owns the land, then they will follow the injunctions of the Hebrew Bible about how to treat it. And we certainly know that the Roman use of land was kind of horrifying. You know, clear-cutting of forests right and left that caused massive erosion. One of the reasons why the city of Ephesus is a really cool ecological site nowadays is because it had to be abandoned, because after they clear-cut the forests, there was nothing to prevent the erosion, and so it kept silting up the harbor, and it became unusable. And now the city of Ephesus is about 10 miles inland because of that silting process, instead of being on the actual coastline. Okay, then here's Jesus' Sermon on the Plain, and these are the Beatitudes in Luke. Blessed are the poor. Again, this is tokoi, the destitute. You actually own God's dominion. I'm a little afraid about that because I'm not one of the destitute. Like, I want to know where I fit then, you know. Blessed are you who are hungry, you will be filled, you who weep will laugh, etc. This doesn't map up quite as well to the Leviticus 25 paradigm. Some, you know, not quite. And then you also get this extra piece about endurance and persecution, and that will be rewarded by God. And then finally, the passage that is the most familiar to us, the Lord's Prayer, which in my view is praying for a permanent Jubilee reality. Now that's not going to sell politically anywhere, right? But here's where you can start to have a sort of jumping off point to do, what does Christian spirituality look like then? You know, if this is kind of the fundamental grounding for Christian spirituality, how does that help us to live sort of already but not yet within this dominion of God? And how does that give us the energy to change the socio-political, economic realities around us, to make those, to alleviate the suffering that we see? So the Basileia, we pray for the Basileia to come, for God's dominion to come, as opposed to the dominion of Rome. Give us our, usually we say daily. Epiousion is an interesting word because it has this eschatological connotation. It's like, it's the bread for that day in the time of crisis, right? And so I should have put the Hunger Games picture back here, but put it up earlier. I don't know, some of you probably have seen the Hunger Games films. In that time of crisis, where it's about who's going to live to the next day, this is where we find daily bread. This is when we get divine bread. And it hints back to, we're in the middle of celebrating Sukkot, right? It hints back to the manna in the desert and that time when Israel was totally reliant upon God for survival. Forgive us our, usually we say sins. Hamartia means missing the mark. It's sort of like if you have ever been, if you've ever done archery or shooting or whatever, you know. When I first started archery, well, it's a good thing there was open space behind the target. That's all I can say, right? It's like, or just in the dirt right in front of you know, and gradually over time you finally get it on the target somewhere, you know, and gradually as you get better, you get closer to the mark. So this notion of quote sin as something where it's about we're learning how to be human in a better way, right? And nobody's perfect at that. So it's not a deadly thing. I mean, it can be if you don't care that you're missing the mark. But it's not a permanent kind of state, right? It's you just keep on trying to approximate, you know, and get closer to where's the center of the mark. You have to know what the mark is, though, right? What's the target you're trying to hit? And don't bring us to the time of trial, which again is something about the last days, right? So this Lord's Prayer that we say almost all the time, I mean pretty much every day, actually matches up really well to Leviticus 25. And now that should be interesting to us as Christians about here's a prayer that came into the tradition that really fundamentally carried over the Jubilee concept from the Hebrew Bible, and yet somehow we have managed to dislocate it from the really concrete realities that were inherent to the Jubilee tradition. How do we get that back, I guess, is my last question. So in the Jesus Proclamation, you have the fulfillment of Jubilee, or at least he's proclaiming that the beginning is happening. The fulfillment of the Jubilee is happening. That in the inbreaking basileia, inbreaking dominion of God, Jesus and his disciples actualize this fulfillment. For us, we are left with these questions. How do we liberate the land from oppressive control and misuse? I mean, appropriate use of land, obviously, right? Catholic Church has always said private property is acceptable, right? But it is a question of how do you use that land in an appropriate way that's sustainable, that's healthy for everybody, and not just the folks who make money off of it. How do you liberate people from imprisonment, slavery, all those kinds of things that we're facing today? And I noticed that I am at time here. So this took way longer than I thought, but thank you very much. Do you have any rejoinder, other kind of conversation you want to do? I know that some people might want to take off and have a little break here. But yes, please.
So just a practical question. Thank you very much for this. You know, high school often charity is a pretty easy sell. You can have groups on campus that do a lot of charitable works.
Right.
In terms of justice, as my experience has been, our classrooms are sometimes the only place where we can dig in like this.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any suggestions, and this lesson is kind of one of them perhaps at some level, but other ways to dig into the concept of justice as the other flip of what we're trying to do in your classroom to connect to students? I mean, maybe they can't talk about debt forgiveness and owning property, but depression, anxiety, relationships, these are things that they're thinking about. So,
Sure.
I don't know, some ideas.
Sure. And you might be surprised, actually, how many of them are aware of some of those other things. I mean, I was totally startled. I shouldn't bang on that. It's recording. I was totally startled that I had 2 homeless kids in my class. I mean, John Carroll. Wow, that really kind of threw me. So, you know, who knows? Because it's not something we're supposed to know, right? But one thing I would say is don't talk about the poor as them. You know, talk about the poor as us. And that's a tricky thing to get in the habit, right? To build that habit. But another thing, I almost did it today, and then I thought, no, I don't really want to tick people off before I ever get started. But you know, I almost divided you up and was going to have you count off and only talk to. I mean, I was estimating. Dr. Hannenberg told me how many people had signed up for the session. I was only going to talk to 7 people for the first 5 minutes, which would be 10%, you know, more or less of who was in here. But like I said, I didn't want to riot, and I didn't want to make people miserable on a day when they're supposed to be having a refreshing day from, you know, school and stuff like that. But you can do stuff like that in your class, right? Where how many kids you got in the room, maybe 25 or whatever, have 2 people stand up and say, you're the only 2, or, you know, you are the ones who will go to college. One of you sit down. Okay, you're the one who will graduate. You know, I mean, you can, when you make people move physically, and this is the brilliant, one of the brilliant insights of Catholicism, right? Is we think with our bodies. You know, so what we do with our bodies matters. So when you make people move physically, and you can ask a series of questions about, you know, are you the first, do you intend to go to college? Are you the first generation who will go to college? You know, you can ask about different kind of socioeconomic indicators. One hopes that you got a little bit of a spread in your class. You know, get them thinking about that. When I talk to, I'm a merit badge counselor for one of the Eagle required merit badges for Boy Scouting, and that one is personal management. And one of the questions, personal management has to do with managing your time and your money. So one of the questions in personal management is, you know, tell me about your charitable giving. And it's always really fascinating because I get 2 kind of different answers. One is, well, that's about when I have money left over at the end of the month and I give what's left, okay? And then I get the other ones who are saying, I tithe. You know, it's the 10% off the top, and that's what I give. And then I decide how I'm going to spend the rest of my money once I've made my contribution to people who aren't as well off as I am, and who need to have, you know, who need those resources and actually have the right to those resources. So what we want to do somehow is to get kids to that point, you know, where it is about people have a right to a decent standard of living. People do have a right to health care. They do have a right to, you know, to property, to be able to have a stable family home, that sort of thing. So I don't know if that really helps or not, but those are a couple things that I've tried. Yeah, John.
So you had mentioned how these economic, political, social realities happen in a communal context within the Jubilee year, in Leviticus, as opposed to like a personal family dynamic that our students would be more apt to realizing today. But like I'm thinking specifically of slavery and how it would take shape in like very explicit forms in like the Leviticus writings, and like not to disregard people who are suffering from sexual slavery today, but I don't think it happens as explicitly today. It's maybe more like implicit slavery, where you might feel enslaved to another person's actions, right? This idea of like codependency that developed out of the Al-Anon movement, where my spouse, my significant other is an abuser of substances, and that controls my life. So the Leviticus context is more communal, but maybe our realities today of like maybe implicit slavery are interpersonal. Like a high school student is controlled by this idea that everybody's watching me, everybody's looking at me, and I'm going to act, and I'm going to assume the role that they want me to take up. So like, I think the question would be, if this is our new model for today, like, can we get students to realize like, you might not be explicitly enslaved, but slavery in a way kind of happens.
Yes, thank you for that comment. So I would say 2 things. One is we don't, it is, I think, important as far as a touchstone for high school age kids. It is important to talk about interpersonal realities and peer group dynamics and close relationships, whether it's familial or dating or whatever it is, definitely there's a way to get a hook there, right, to get kids to start thinking about this. But once you've got it, I don't think you want to stop there, right? We have to get them to think about the broader issue for two reasons. One is because if you're only thinking about this, the propensity for a student to keep returning to that same there's a propensity toward depressive paradigms, in terms of thinking, right? That you get kind of locked into a particular way of thinking about it. Okay, so I am enslaved by this, this relationship, but the thing is, it's a family relationship. What do I do about that? It's like, I can't. So they feel powerless, right? The thing we want to avoid is bringing up problems and then having them walk away thinking, there's nothing I can do, right? And I don't think you were suggesting that that's what you wanted to get across, but so it is, you do have to know your population in the class and how will this bring up kind of horror circumstances in the student's life, is it a good way to go, or is it better to go in a different direction with that? The other thing though is to because they are, here's the moment of idealism being possible, right? Once they get to college, some of them have lost that already, which is a shame. But in high school age, a lot of people can be idealistic, right? So get them to start thinking about the bigger picture and, well, maybe I actually can't do, it's my mom or it's my dad or it's, my brother, whatever, I can't do anything about this. But if I get involved in this type of activity here, I can see myself making a difference here. Once I can see that I can make a difference somewhere, now I have a really good sense of agency. And then maybe I can come back to this relationship stronger and say, I know you've got this addiction problem. You know what? I can't fix that. I didn't cause it. I can't fix it. I love you, but that's your thing, I'm here when you want to try to address it. I can't help you stay addicted.
I can't be enmeshed in this relationship.
Right, and when it's a voluntary relationship as opposed to a familial relationship where, nobody gets a choice about that, right? Then you say, yeah, for this I need to, what I need is space. I need to back out because I want my relationships to make me a better person. That's my call as a Christian, is to enter into relationships that are going to make me a better person. So it's not about me backing out. You have to be careful with that too, right? Because our whole culture is all about me, right? And we don't want to reinforce that. So how do you make it not about me? It's really about my telos, What's the kind of person I need to become? What's the kind of person that, yes, I want to be, but I want to be that person because this is the direction God's calling me. Yes?
Yeah, with his question, I just wanted to say throughout the presentation, when you were talking about freedom, I think a lot of this has to do with, and even when we go back to the Old Testament, freedom from attachment. And so when we think about attachment, we're attached to our property, and when we don't have that attachment, we're actually free to put our trust in God. It's kind of like the Israelites' journey through the Old Testament, even after the Babylonian exile. And so with that, the gentleman's question before that was talking about the homeless kid, who you had mentioned it, the homeless kid who's just thinking, well, I don't have food on the table. And the idea there would be, or the way I looked at it, is that it's, and you had mentioned the solidarity, that one would, if you feel that you're not doing God's will, if you're not in solidarity, so it would be even with the kid who is, has an alcoholic parent, well, let's get in solidarity with other people who can support me in that way, because that's how God calls us. And then they can experience that freedom from the illness, the homelessness, and it might not be for a long time. Unfortunately, with high school students, they want to see the automatic instant gratification, but it might be a process for them to see that. And I think it's through the solidarity and support of community that can help them to understand that. So I think it is a process, and unfortunately, it's not something that can happen right away. But I just feel that with the detachment from property and people, sometimes that are causing that, turmoil in our lives, we're actually free to put our trust in God, and I think you mentioned that in your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. The thing with, of course, we're always all in process, right? The thing that's really important for this age group, as you probably know better than I do, is they have to be able to see some progress. Don't tell me, yes, I realize it's a long-term thing, but I just don't have the energy. I really can't. I really can't keep the energy going unless I see that I've made some incremental shifts. So the part of the task really for us as we're guiding people at this age group is, how do you break down the task to small enough incremental steps? So I'm going to work on this one thing this week. Did you make it through? And this is sort of how AA and other 12-step programs work too, right? Is narrowing the focus so that you can see success, because success multiplies, right? But if you don't have success, then why am I doing it? And it's hard, and I'm going to bail, right? Yes.
As Jesus would have understood that Jubilee concept, kind of in our context, in our world's context, where I think a major feature of our world, most people would probably agree, is massive inequality. I think I saw the 5 wealthiest people have as much wealth as half the world, and we're talking about poverty as destitution. Even in America, where there's significant wealth disparity racially along lines of sex. Are there concrete implications of that Jubilee understanding? Can we kind of say Jesus would have prescribed specifically this? Or is it more the Jubilee would just say this is something we should be uncomfortable with and should be working to change?
Well, here's, I called this up earlier on the theory that even though I wasn't talking specifically about Catholic social teaching, that a bunch of you do, right? First of all, I would say yes, there are really concrete things that come out of this. And a number of those concrete things that come out of this are going to tick off people who are neocons and neoliberals both. Because Jesus wasn't a neocon and he wasn't a neoliberal, he was a Jew. He was totally embedded in the Jewish tradition. He had absorbed not only the texts of the prophets, but the fundamental meaning, the fundamental approach of the prophets, right? And because he loved God. Okay, so you have to just face that, and maybe you just start off the class by saying, okay, I'm just telling you up front that I'm going to, if you feel like personally slighted here, that's okay, because I plan to insult everyone equally. Now, my professor, the class that got me into this room, a class on the historical Jesus, and I'm the only one out of 300 kids laughing in the back corner. I felt a little bit funny, but that was his comment on the first day, and I thought, I'm going to like this guy, Now, can that really work with 14-year-olds? I don't know. You know your own people better than I would, but people are going to get upset about it. Is that a problem? I think actually that energy is good to channel, right? The trick is, if you're going to tap that energy, if you're going to try to tame the dragon, right? If you're going to let those dragons out first and then try to tame them, you have to model how do we talk to each other. Because you're going to have people in the class who are neoliberals, and you're going to have people in the class who are neocons, and then you're going to have people like me who think that this neo stuff is bunk, Let's go for hardcore radical. I don't, none of this neo stuff, right? Jesus was a radical. He went back to the roots of the teaching and the center point of the message, right? So how do you get them to talk to each other? And this, even though it's not specifically a theological agenda, is such an important dynamic to cultivate in our country at this time, when radical, rejection of the other because if you don't agree with it, you must be a moron. That sort of reflexive understanding that anyone disagrees with me is an idiot. So that would be really good. But yeah, I think there definitely are, and some of them are in this list here, And so the bishops, sometimes are good and sometimes are a little bit mealy-mouthed about. I was trying to be polite. At least sometimes they're good, about speaking out on these issues. Now, what happens, though, right? People who are Ayn Rand economists, they want to blow it off and say, well, that's stupid and they don't know anything. They're bishops. They should shut up and talk about theology. They should stick to religion, stay out of economics. It's like, duh, you know what? They're both social phenomena. What's different about theologians versus economists today? We actually know we have an ideology. We think about it. We critically appropriate that ideology. We challenge it, right? That's our job, actually, is to challenge that. Economists, no, they just spout it as if it somehow, fell from heaven. And so, sure, David, go for it. But, talk to your principal first. But I think this list here, universal health care, that's something the bishops are pushing on. Whoa. What would that have done for the 5 million people who went bankrupt because they couldn't pay the bills? What would that do for all the people who have adult parents who are now in hospice or some sort of assisted living in states like Ohio and Minnesota, where even though it's your parent who incurred those debts, the state's starting to allow health companies and hospice care companies and stuff like that to go after you if there's no money in the estate. Okay? And even if you fight it, it still costs thousands of dollars. I'm here to tell you I had to do it for my mom. There was no money in the estate. It's like, but it's not my debt. Doesn't matter. Right? So, that sort of thing's going to keep happening because, of course, lots of you folks in this room are part of the sandwich generation, as they're called, right? Yes, we have time, okay? I'm supposed to shut up now? Lunch is ready. Oh, goody. Well, thank you.